we've broken it down, Ryan. We've talked matchups. We've talked, statistical analysis. We've talked all the different aspects of it. I want to have a little bit of a big picture conversation today.
Yep.
And we've tried to stick to the X's and O's and the analysis and all that this week. But the reality is, when you look at this game, Ryan, this is a huge game for Notre Dame beyond just the 2022 season. This is a big game for Notre Dame, one way or the other, right? And so when I look at it, it's just one of those things, Ryan, where if you win, it's seismic. If you lose, then we get into, well, how much did you lose by? And the answer to that is going to determine just the perception of Notre Dame. So all of the momentum that has been built this offseason by Marcus Freeman either skyrockets with a win, continues to slowly grow with a competitive loss, and gets undercut with a big loss. So all of those things are on the table, and that's just that. And of course, there's college football playoff, opportunities and resume building on the line here. This is just you try not to put too much into game one, but when it's number 5 versus number 2, it's hard not to realize that this is a big moment.
Well, and they're most likely the best team you're going to play in the regular season, and they're also a Midwest power, right? And they have been the Midwest power. So, I mean, to your point, Brian, this isn't just a great football game with the potential for a team maybe to make a championship run, that type of, or both teams to potentially make a championship run. It's also, it impacts recruiting. It impacts just kind of the reputation in the Midwest. It impacts everything. And it impacts the trajectory of this program. Because like you said, Marcus Freeman has done a great job and his staff this offseason to take a lot of the momentum and to continue it throughout the recruiting and excitement building from fans' perspective and media outlets. I mean, there's been a lot of excitement around Notre Dame football. And he has a chance to not only continue that momentum, but to skyrocket it.
Right.
I mean, it's massive. I mean, I don't think you can undersell how important this game is just from a perception standpoint for Notre Dame. Whether they win by 1 or by 100, a win would go so far to saying like, hey man, this plan is real. Like, this is different, right? Like, this is a step in the absolute positive direction. So this game can go, a couple different ways. Obviously, if Notre Dame does lose or loses handedly, then it's going to kind of be monikered as, it's the same old type of Notre Dame, right? Like, it's the same. You're not going to get out of that stigma. The only way to break out of that little
well, that's the world we live in right now, right, Ryan? I mean, that's the world that Brian Kelly created, and that's what Marcus Freeman was hired to change, right? And I get where you're kind of coming from with just trying to find the right way to say it. But look, there's been this battle. Look, this battle didn't happen when Brian Kelly left. This is a battle that we've been waging at Irish Breakdown for years. Oh, he's gone 54-9, and oh, they've done this, and oh, they've made 2 playoff appearances, and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, well, they weren't competitive on any of those big stages they were on. They built up that great record against bad teams. Brian Kelly went 54-9 the last 5 years, because 54-10 is Notre Dame's overall record. I'm not blaming him for the Oklahoma State loss, although somebody was like, well, Brian Kelly never would have blown a 28-7 lead in the Fiesta Bowl. I said, well, Brian Kelly never would have had a 28-7 lead in the Fiesta Bowl, right? First of all. But number 2, it's 54-9. They went 10-9 against teams that finished in the top 25. That means they went 44-0 against teams that were not ranked. You don't get your career built on teams that are not ranked. You get your career built on teams that are ranked. And I think they had 1-5 against teams that finished in the top 10. And that's what we're trying to see changed here, right? That's why we were hard on Brian Kelly. But that's the standard that Marcus Freeman is being held to too, Ryan. And it's like, look, the expectation is that you need to start not only winning the games you're supposed to win, but maybe win some of these games that you're not supposed to win.
Right.
And you have opportunities to do it. And this year especially, you're going to have several opportunities to do it. And so what this game is, it's a measuring stick for Notre Dame. Where are you? Can you really make all those changes let's just get to the nitty gritty of this, right? Brian Kelly, this, that, and the other thing. And this is the argument I've had for years. Hey, look, here's where we're at, and this is the record, and that's, I don't want to rehash all that kind of stuff, but here's the two things I'll point to. In 12 years, Brian Kelly went 19-29 against teams that finished in the top 25. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, he got better in his last 5 years, 10-9 compared to 19, and so that was what, 9-20. Okay. Mm-hmm. But you're still borderline 500. 3-16 for his career against top 10 teams. And the thing is 2 of those 3 wins came in the 12 and 13 seasons. So from 14 to 21, there was 1 win over a team that finished the season ranked in the top 10. And there's only 2 against teams that were ranked in the top 10 when they played. So like if you look at the numbers and say, well, what about top 10 teams when they played? Well, it's 4 wins. Because Michigan State in 2013 and Stanford in 2012 were not ranked in the top 10 when they played. Stanford was like 12th or 15th when Notre Dame beat them in 2012. And then Michigan State, who they beat in 2013, who finished 13-1 and ranked 3rd, was unranked. So you take them out, and then you add Stanford 2018, you add Michigan State in 2012, who finished 7-6. And then there was one other game in there. I'm trying to remember what was the other top 10 game that they had, that they beat a team that was ranked, but they won 4 games since 2010 against teams that were ranked in Oklahoma in 2012 was ranked in the top 10 at the time, fell out, but still they fell out because they lost Notre Dame. I mean, if they had a win over Notre Dame and still only lost 2 games, they're a top 10 team. So it's not fair to just completely dismiss it like it doesn't matter. But so it's 4 wins in 12 years over top 10 teams. That's the stigma. We've said this all week, right, Ryan? Like, hey, here's the deal. If you don't, I just saw what you were laughing at. If you don't know, I mean, if you don't like the fact that Notre Dame is disrespected, 17.5-point underdog, and all these other type of things, but it's earned. You've earned this reputation because you have consistently been defeated, and oftentimes defeated convincingly in these games. And yes, there's been the occasional Florida State 2014 and the occasional, win over Clemson and all that they were lacking. And the 2 Georgia games are competitive. I'll give you that. But mixed around that has been a bunch of Miamis and Michigans, and from 2019, you've had the postseason games. You've had the Arizona State debacle of 2014. They were a top 10 team.
I tried to keep that game out of my memory, Brian.
Right.
Thank you very much for bringing that up.
But you're down 34-3 at one point. You come all the way back, make it 34-31. You still end up losing 55-30. I mean, you have so many of those games. It's like, that's why this exists. So the question, Ryan, and this is the thing that we're going to find out in 2022, is how quickly can that get changed? How quickly can that losing culture get changed? And that's what we're going to find out. Can it get changed in one off season? Does it require a couple close losses before you finally kick that door down? Those are the answers we don't know. And that's what makes this game big, because Marcus Freeman and his staff out of the gate get tested for, okay, where are you? Right? It's kind of like Ohio State is what Mike Elko said about the Notre Dame offensive line in 2017. They're human lie detectors. If you're not where you need to be as a program, if your talent level isn't where it needs to be, if your preparation, your coaching isn't where it needs to be, you're going to find out in this opener. And if it is where it needs to be, then you're going to find that out too. And I think that's what's at stake. Is it's obviously there's all the things at stake, but you're going to learn a lot about yourself, and then say, okay, well, we've got 3 weeks to get ready for North Carolina and get these things fixed. We got 5 weeks to get ready for BYU. We've got 2 months to get ready for Clemson. And so figure out where you come up short, what can you fix now, what needs to be fixed on the recruiting trail, and then roll. And that's what I love about this game, is it gives you a chance to really get rolling.
Well, I'm going to give Brian Kelly some credit for 1 second, Brian, right? We talked about the good that he did have is that he got him back to a level where you have to win double-digit games every single year for it to be considered close to a success, right? So that's the fact. That's why this first game can be a barometer, in my opinion, right? Because if Marcus Freeman walked into a cluster, like, I mean, you can't expect this first game to be an answer to if they have arrived or close to closing the gap, or they have eliminated the gap, or whatever the mantra will be after this game. But the fact that Notre Dame is in a pretty good spot when Marcus Freeman took over. That's the reason that you can kind of do a measuring stick and a barometer. Like it's a
perceived
true test
to be in a good spot is what I would say.
Yes. Well, yeah. To a degree, I agree with that. Yeah. I would just say though, I mean, they do have, there is a level that is expected at Notre Dame over the last couple of years, obviously, since the 4-8 debacle. Since then, Notre Dame has had regular success, at least from a regular season perspective, for who they play football against, right? So I think that you are measuring yourself against one of the blue bloods, one of the teams that has been consistently a good football team, a team that has had multiple championships in the last 20 years. Like this is a good barometer and a measuring stick. And then you add in the regional aspect of everything, that Notre Dame, again, is a Midwest team playing against another Midwest power. And that is a great measuring stick. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity for all those things, all those factors to kind of be considered here, because Marcus Freeman did walk into an okay situation. Like it wasn't a bad situation. It wasn't like a dumpster fire.
I'm not saying, it's not like what, I agree. But what I would say is I think, as we've argued in the past, that the situation was not as strong as people made it out to be. Not so much because the talent was lacking, but because the culture was lacking. And I think that's the thing that we have to find out is Notre Dame good enough to just expect them to go out and consistently beat Ohio State and Alabama and teams like that? No, it's not there yet.
Sure.
But is it good enough to where you can go out and in games where I think you do have matchup advantages, like I think they have against Ohio State? I think Notre Dame has more matchup advantages against Ohio State right now than they do against Alabama, for example.
Sure.
But I would then argue that I think actually Ohio State matches up better against Alabama than they do Notre Dame in some areas. I mean, that's just kind of how football works, right? And so that's the thing for me is that the talent gap is not such, and there's one exception, and I'll say that in a second. The talent is not as such that you should be seeing what we have seen in these big games in the past. That's my point. And look, Oregon can go into Columbus and beat them. Michigan can do what they did to them, but yet Notre Dame shouldn't be expected to be within 3 touchdowns, barely within 3 touchdowns. That's my thing. And I get why the odds are what they are, because that's about the only way they can get people to bet on. I mean, if the spread was 7 points, no one's betting on Notre Dame except the diehard Notre Dame fans. Nobody.
No.
And that's why the spread is what it is. It's not disrespect. It's about trying to get people to bet on both sides. And because of Notre Dame's track record in these games, that is why it is what it is. So that's the culture, that's the environment, that's the perception that Marcus Freeman has to change. And we're going to find out how quickly he can or cannot change it and just where they are. Because I will say the only time that I felt in the last, really 10 years, really since the Orange Bowl, basically in 2012, there's only been 2 games that I can think of where I just felt like Notre Dame was clearly the far inferior team talent-wise. 2014 USC, partly because Notre Dame had so many injured players in that game. I mean, you didn't have Sheldon Day, you didn't have Jerron Jones, you didn't have Drew Tranquill. I mean, you had so many of your best players were out that game because they were so beat up by that point in time in the year. And then the other one was Alabama 2020. Now, I thought Notre Dame should have been more competitive, but Bama clearly had the better team that day, and they had the better team going in. It's kind of funny, Ryan. I was looking up my game predictions for that game, and so I kind of had some fun with it, looking at the Rose Bowl in 2020, and so what I did was I made 2 game predictions for that game, and I thought about doing it for this one too, but I decided not to. But my game prediction for that game, I did 2. I did a heart prediction and a head prediction. And my heart prediction was 37-34 Notre Dame. But my analysis prediction, my real prediction was 47-20. So Notre Dame actually finished a little closer, but it's because, as I said, Alabama called the dogs off. Like my point is, it was clear going into that game that Alabama was significantly better than Notre Dame that season. Notre Dame also had some injuries. You didn't have Braden Lindsey. You didn't have Kevin Austin. You had a lot of other issues going on. And so, but all these other games, Clemson, the ACC title game, that was not a game where Notre Dame was the inferior team. I'm sorry, it wasn't. They had the inferior quarterback, but Notre Dame also moved the ball up and down the field early on Clemson. I don't feel that they had the inferior teams to Georgia either year. Now, could you argue Georgia was a little bit better? Yes, but they weren't inferior, meaning they didn't belong on that field.
Right.
And so to me, I feel the same way about this game Now, the thing we have to learn is, has the coaching and the health of the program mentally, emotionally, spiritually, culturally, technically, physically changed enough to where you can now go out and say, hey, we're going to play to our potential and go out there and win this thing. That is what we're going to find out about this football team tomorrow night.
I'm very interested too, Brian, just from like the jump, from like the first kickoff, quick return, whatever it is, from the first snap, to see how this team carries itself. Like, that's what I'm really interested with. Because, like, yeah, we saw Coach Freeman as the head coach against Oklahoma State, but like, I don't think that's a real barometer for what this team is going to look like from a emotional game day perspective, right? Like, I don't believe that.
Can I just say something real quick?
Of course, yes.
I hope that we see this team come out in the first half like that team came out.
Well, yes, right?
Yes. You're correct. I just always kind of chuckle. Like, you're absolutely right, but I'm just like, but can we take a little bit from that game here? Can we take the first half, from that game?
Hey, man,
and bring it.
If they're up, what was it, 28-14 at halftime?
I'll tell you this. If they're up 28-7 right before halftime, I don't think they're going to have the same mistakes that they made in that game. Correct.
Right. I mean, that was the one good thing about that game, is although it was a meltdown and it wasn't what you wanted, obviously, in the first game, but it could be a learning measurement, right? Like, it could be a learning experience for the staff and the players associated that were part of that game to know, like, this is what we can't do, right? Like, when we're up, we need to learn from our mistakes in that situation. Right. So I think it can be a positive if it's used correctly. But I mean, more than anything, man, like, is this team going to be super loose before this game, right? Like, are they going to be fired up, running around, acting like they've been there before? Are they going to be a little tight? Like, I'm going to assume it's the former, just because that's just kind of the vibe that we get just from practices and the Oklahoma State game and how Coach Freeman carries himself overall. But I am just looking so forward to just seeing the pregame atmosphere. Like, that's really what because I think that's going to matter, like, because we've talked about it a bunch. There have been, in those big games in recent years, seems like the teams are always a little tight going into those, right? Like, they're a little bit like animated and not like really letting it hang out, letting it loose type of thing. So I'm excited to see what the atmosphere is for Notre Dame heading into that first kickoff, because I have to think that they're going to be pumped up and electric, man, because like they need it. I mean, because that could be the separator, Brian. I mean, it could be the separator. I mean, they've obviously been honing the finer points of coaching and playing and being a part of a scheme and doing all that type of stuff. But at the end of the day, man, if we think that there is some back and forth as far as Ohio State stronger at this position, Notre Dame stronger at this position, there is some jockeying of talent. So a main separator could be like, who is the team that is the most loose and ready to just kind of get it going, man? And like, I'm just really excited to see the energy around this program on Saturday. Tomorrow is Saturday. I can't believe it.
It's wild. It took a while to get here, but it is now here. You know what, Ryan? I'm just looking forward. Here's where this all boils down to. And somebody in the chat said it, and I was waiting to say it, and they said it. So I love when great minds think alike. And here's it's the history expert said, we can learn while winning. And to me, that's exactly where we're coming from. Like, and that's what I love about the program that Alabama has built, where Nick Saban gets more pissed off in interviews after wins than he tends to after losses. Now, they don't have a lot of losses, and some of the times after losses, he gets pretty fired up. But, for me, Ryan, I look at it and I say, when does Notre Dame get to the point where there's no more moral victories? You actually have victories that you can then say, hey, you know what? Like, we had a great win today, but we know we got to get better. If we want to keep winning, if we want to beat North Carolina and BYU and Clemson and USC week after week after week after week, we got to get better here. We got to get better there. We got this one done, but, we got to go make those changes. And then, of course, both of these staffs completely look overhauled from where they were a year ago. Obviously, Ohio State has the one constant at the very top, but these are also two very new look coaching staffs, Ryan. And so now it's about, okay, which of the changes ends up having the biggest impact? Can the new coaching staff hires with Tommy Rees now having Harry Heastan and D'Lo McCullough and Chancey Stuckey and Jared Parker, have a similar or better impact than Jim Knowles and Tim Walton? And I'm, for the life of me, cannot remember their other DB coach's name. I apologize. And mean no disrespect. It's just slipping my mind right now. of who their other new hire was, but they've overhauled that staff. They've got a new O-line coach in. Notre Dame has a new D coordinator. Those are going to be an interesting aspect to this as well, Ryan, because I want to see kind of, so that's, that's kind of where I see it, is something I'm really excited about, to see how this develops. Yep. Right. And to see which of the moves ends up working out the best in this particular game. That's going to make this really, really, really fun.
And it's weird to evaluate sometimes, in my opinion, because sometimes hires are more long-term based than they are short-term based, right? Like, just because, so if like, let's say whatever side wins tomorrow night, it could be the simple fact that a coach was hired and put into a position where they were in a better position to succeed early, right? Like, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were the best hire long-term. So again, it's a long-term versus short-term thing. But regardless, man, this is a great opportunity for Notre Dame. It's a great opportunity for Ohio State. It is a big game. And I kind of love that this is the first game of the season, Brian. If I'm being completely honest, man, like I want to know what this team is to a large degree, like I want to know where they are, because there's a lot that you can take out of a win. There's a lot you can take out of a loss. I think that there's just going to be some general understanding, because I'll be completely honest about this, and I've talked about this. There's a lot of projection to this team. I think they can be really good, but it's also they're slightly they're a slight enigma to a degree, right? Because it's like there's a little bit of volatility to how good they can be, or how just good they could be. I mean, there is a little bit of a chasm, in my opinion. Could this team maybe be a team that is set up better to, hey, we have a nice 2022 season, but 2023 is the year? Like, there's a lot of question marks as far as when is the peak, and how good this team can be early on versus the end of the season. And, some positions have wild cards to a degree, a couple wide receivers and secondary, and there's a lot of things to figure out. But I think that the great thing is that we're going to have an answer to quite a few questions after the end, after the final whistle tomorrow night. So it's going to be very interesting to see.
I think the thing that I guess kind of has frustrated me all offseason, Ryan, is kind of what you said about Notre Dame is not inaccurate. We don't really know what this team is going to be. My frustration is why is everyone acting like we do know what Ohio State is going to be? Like, why is there the assumption that their defense is all of a sudden going to stop being terrible, which, let's be honest, it was a lot last year, and Notre Dame's offense or defense isn't going to make jumps with their new coaches? Why is there an assumption that Justin Fry is going to fix the Ohio State offensive line, but Al Golden and other things aren't going to, make Notre Dame's secondary better? Right. And those, I guess, are my frustrations. Is it just seems like there's an inconsistency there. But again, that just kind of goes through and points to the whole thing of what we're talking about. The assumption is because Ohio State has won these games and Notre Dame has not. And that's ultimately where it comes from. And we talked about this. I wrote an article about this earlier this week, Ryan. Notre Dame is a 17.5-point underdog. And I say this figuratively, not literally. I understand why they are literally a 17.5 underdog. It's about betting. It's about trying to create as many people betting on both sides. Because if you're Vegas and everybody's betting Ohio State and Notre Dame wins, you are golden. But if Ohio State wins, then you're kind of, it's not as good of a weekend for you. And so you do want to try to create the betting on both sides. What I mean more is like figuratively from a perception standpoint of why everyone is still betting on Ohio State, despite the fact it was a 14.5-point spread, because you earned that as Notre Dame because of what you did or didn't do, I should say. If you want to change it, change it. And we've been here before, right? And Georgia is very similar. 2019, Notre Dame was a 16-point underdog going into Athens in 2019. And they had a moral victory. Lost by 6 and got the ball at midfield with 2 minutes left, basically, and couldn't get it done, but you battled and you earned Georgia's respect. I'm sick of earning people's respect by not getting blown out, right? Like, this is freaking Notre Dame. Like, Notre Dame should not be getting moral victories because they didn't get blown out. Like, you know what I mean? Like, Notre Dame shouldn't have a head coach saying, hey, we only lost by 27 to Clemson, but Alabama lost by 28. Hey, we only lost by 17 to Alabama, but Ohio State lost by, 28? Was it 28? Something like that. This is freaking Notre Dame, dude. You don't brag about almost winning or not losing by as much as people thought. When Marcus Freeman has arrived, the moment he's arrived, is when people look at these games and say, of course Notre Dame's going to win this game, because that's what they've done. Of course Notre Dame's going to be a 6-point favorite over Clemson. Did you see what they did to Ohio State? Right? That's when you know your program has arrived. And honestly, if you really want to get down to the nitty-gritty of why I got sick of Brian Kelly the last few years, it's that right there. I got sick of a coach who basically took pride in not losing by as much as other teams lost to the team that won a championship. I got sick of Brian Kelly trying to say, hey, look, nobody gave us a shot against Georgia, and we only lost by 6. You know what I mean? I want to see a coach and I want to see a program that goes out there and says, you don't want to respect us? I guarantee you over the next 3 hours, you will learn to respect us. And if you don't, it's going to be you're going to have a lot of explaining to do at your press conference after this game, because we're going to take it to you. That's where this program needs to get to. And I don't know if they're there yet. We're going to find out tomorrow. But that's when we'll know that Marcus Freeman has arrived, when we start talking about we're not having this 17.5-point underdog conversation anymore. You know, it's like, no, you Notre Dame's got a shot to win this sucker, because they've got the talent, they've got the coaching, and they're back to being what a Notre Dame team is supposed to be. I cannot promise you that Notre Dame will be the fastest team on the field Saturday night. I can't promise you that. Does Notre Dame have better speed than people think? Yes. Can I guarantee that they're faster than Ohio State top to bottom? No, I can't guarantee that. In spots they are, in spots they aren't. But here's what I should be able to guarantee. Should be able to. And we don't know. There's no question about this one thing. They will be the most physical team on the field on Saturday night. We used to at least be able to promise you that.
Yep.
Win, lose, or draw, you used to at least be able to promise that. That's been gone. That's gone too. Those are things that I want to come back to, is where, hey, you know what? You may end up beating Notre Dame. This is the era I grew up in, right? And makes me sad you couldn't experience this firsthand. You may beat Notre Dame, but you're limping away from that fight.
You're going to have a black eye.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? And that's where I want to get to. But then also, even beyond that, where, no, I'm sorry, you're not winning against Notre Dame. I grew up in an era when Miami won 3 titles in 5 years, and the 2 years they didn't win a title were years Notre Dame beat them. That's where I want to get back to, where they're beating that team. They bring in the Florida State, who was the premier team in the early 90s outside of Miami. Bama had a couple good years too, and you beat them. And not only do you beat them from start to finish. You outplay them from start to finish. You go to the Sugar Bowl and you play Florida, and everybody's dismissing you, and you curb stomp them in the fourth quarter because you are the more physical team. You play number 1 Colorado in the Orange Bowl after you lost to Miami at the end of the season, and you beat them, convincingly beat them, because you're the more physical football team. You're the better coached football team. That's where Notre Dame needs to get back to. Brian Kelly had no desire to get him back there. He thought Notre Dame kept him from getting there. I think Brian Kelly kept Notre Dame from getting there. Marcus Freeman's job is to show which one was right. And step 1 to that is Saturday night. So that's my thoughts on the game. Right? I don't know if you have a response to that before we go to predictions.
All I want to say is that I want to know what it's like for my fandom for one of these games to be a victory, Brian. That's a starting point, right? That's a starting point. Can you imagine being the team? And I know you can imagine it, because it was at one point that this was a fact for Notre Dame in your lifetime, where Notre Dame goes to a game against a top 10 team, a 10-win team, and oh man, you kept it within 27. Wow, must be nice. That's the best game we played all season. Right. Yeah, okay. I want competition. And we've heard that so often from Marcus Freeman all offseason. I don't want there to be a second during the game tomorrow where you have to question if Notre Dame was good enough to compete with that team, right? Good enough to win is a completely different conversation, but I don't want this to be a situation where the talent deficit is just so stark that you're just like, Notre Dame doesn't deserve to be on the field. I want to see I want to see proof that Notre Dame is closer than maybe a lot of people think they are. And that starts tomorrow. It's a big indicator.
That they're there.
Or that they're there.
Right.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Well, hey, in order to get there, though, you need to prove some first steps, right? That it might be the time. So got to see it, man. Got to see it. It's a show me business at the end of the day. And I hope that Notre Dame is able to show it tomorrow night.